class. This week we'll be looking at language and culture. The agenda of the week is looking at the readings of Tanya Hernandez. We're looking at Afro-Latinas, Latinos anti-Black bias, and cis categorization of the Latinos, race, ethnicity, and others. And again, one of the videos that I also put in from her in a podcast style is looking at African American and Afro-Latinos relations. And lastly, the documentary Afro-Latinos. So the first reading explores the Afro-Latinos identity, focusing on how marginalization and divisibility persist within the beyond Latino communities. It also examines discrimination of colorism, highlighting how lighter skin is often privileged while blackness is devalued. And so the chapter speaks about first Afro-Latinos, Afro-Latinas, Latinos, in their term referring to within the United States who are African ancestry and choose blackness as a racial identity, in addition to identification as along ethnic lines with the Latino relational origins. And it first starts speaking about the census, how important the census is, and speaking about how many million Latinos categorize themselves Latinos in the United States, but also neglect to speak out their blackness within their own identity in the census. And this is where the invisibility exists when we're talking about racial mixture within Latino context. And a lot of the times that happens within our own storytelling when we say it's mestizaje. So mestizaje refers to the mixing of different racial culture groups, most commonly indigenous and European, but it talks about colonization, but also neglects the African diaspora that exists within these stories of the mestizaje. So again, the mestizaje often appears to get dismissed in many ways of Latinas, but also the chapter also talks about one of those things is that being said is you're too black to be Hispanic, and that's very important when we are devaluing, again, the blackness of when we tell that to one another, this racism practice within our own community. But also, what does that mean if you're identities of African Latinx, and then after you hearing these messages, you are going to hit a wall where it's like, wait a minute, what does it mean to identify myself, and how do I protect myself from these folks, right? And also, again, the living conditions, what the chapter talks about, and also the other readings, even in the documentary, speaks about Latinos who identified as blacks, have high unemployment, less education, what are the disparities that happens within these identities. And then the second reading, it examines how census categorization shapes Latino identity, highlighting a preference for whiteness, a distance from blackness. It also addresses the anti-black bias and colorism and the impact of socioeconomic disparities of the role of media representation, political strategies, reinforcing these dynamics, right? So in the chapter does talk about, even with the television that we have, the few channels that we had back in the day. Now it's more, obviously, but back in the day, mostly people were listening to the Spanish channel Telemundo and Univision. But the reading talks about this push that was really focusing on lighter skin, and anything like the novelas, those are soap operas, would always use people of color as workers, dishwashers, nannies, and so forth. So, but also how this chapter reinforces is how are we using blackness even within media, right? So again, when we talk about identity, it goes again, talk about the census and so forth. How many were able to respond to some as others, and not neglecting the Africans' ancestry. But also again, also talks about that within Central America as well. I personally thought about this a lot when I would go put in, where am I? Where am I in these categories, right? And also one of the things that always is confusing is between race, ethnicity, and how does the state or the country want to break you down, but also neglect to mention the different tribes that exist, right? When we talk about, for example, Native people. So what does that mean also with an identity of people that come in here from the Latinx countries that have come from different tribes as well that happen within the African diaspora that gets neglected to be told, right? So often, again, even with this anti-black, one of the things is responses is, when the whites are identification within the Cuban nation, right? And as a way to avoid formal recognition of indigenous, especially African ancestry, within the Latino community, By doing so, you're entitled at that point. You tell yourself, I'm ignore the rest of it if I'm considering myself white. And again, one of the things this chapter speaks about the history. It speaks about about 10 million enslaved African brought to Latin America, and only small percentage of that was brought to the United States. So what does that mean? Well, we are telling the history of enslavement of Africans within Latin America. It gets neglected, it gets untold, not just within the Latin Americas, but also including Mexico as well. When we think about indigenous people, the way they've been represented even in their own countries, right? When I went to Guatemala, what does it mean to the Mayan community, the state that they're living in? And one of those things is hard to understand when these folks have been a lot longer than many of us in these countries. Even one of the hardest piece of reading these chapters is how even with Puerto Ricans, college students are calling darker folks dumb, but gives also praises how even a lot of the internal racism comes within their own practice of higher people, higher status, especially in the politics, when it talks about the governor of Puerto Rico's emphasizing of whiteness and neglecting such any other color within Puerto Rico. All right, so again, we talk about the Afro-Latina experience, African Afro-Latinos experience within all communities, right? We talk about, what are you being told? You don't look Latino. Discrimination, right? We talked about, and again, it reinforces it. This chapter also reinforces again the high unemployment, poverty, less education. What does that mean? What does it mean also, like what happened when you get arrested and so forth? What is the treatment of you of being African Latinx in the community? Not just here within the US, but also outside as well. And also, one of the things I did wanted to show is also Professor Tanya Hernandez speaking about it. So you can hear her own voice in the way she talks about her book and as well. And some of the key notes, key takes that I have is in the history roots. Again, right, talking about the slave trade, the anti-blackness is rooting within history, the lack of racial awareness, not just within the US, but also outside. Again, right, we were talking about the mestizaje. So this here talk about, again, right, this false idea of racial mixing, the anti-blackness, how is that practiced, even the negatory terms such as negro, that is used as normalized. And the Docu Afro-Latino talks about that word as well. The myth and narratives claim that we're all mixed, hidden real racism, framing racism as a class issue, not as a race issue. Social structure of equalities, right? Again, reinforcing what the chapters have said, right, in terms of education and so forth. And also the way that Jim Crow was used in the United States, but how was it used in Latin America, especially when they didn't use Jim Crows. They just knew that those were just custom to just be racist, and that's very heartbreaking to read. And again, identity tensions, Afro-Latinos often mistaken for African Americans, the struggle to recognition, resistance, solidarity. One of those things that they do get lost within history is the power of the Young Lords and the Black Panthers. One of the key takeaways that I left towards the end is this anti-blackness is a global issue, not just a U.S. issue. And also, at the end of the video, reinforces that we need to have bigger discussion of racial awareness that is needed. Because there's a big negligence when we talk about race, ethnicity, and so forth within our own community. And you can see that even now when people are talking about, even when people go, who's doing the concerts and who do they support and so forth. Lastly, one of the biggest important that I wanted to introduce in this week was documentary Afro-Latinos. And I chose this documentary because it talks about vivid experience of these people and their own personal narratives. They're talking about their own story, what is their experience and so forth. And again, right, one of the best things within ethnic studies and these documentaries is talks about the sense of belonging. There's untold stories, and this documentary does really well in doing so. And one of the first images at the documentary talks about the African diaspora that existed within Latin America. It's just not nothing new that happened 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and so forth. It talks about Puerto Rico in 1898, Cuba in 1891, Argentina in 1800. And one of the things is when people look at Argentina as this country that is, primarily white, and it is white for the most part, But also we have to mention who are those people that are in Argentina. And then in this place, in this, documentary speaking about the black folks in Argentina. And the bottom is a lot of the children that are left from the people that have been working in the Panama Canal. This documentary reinforces the untold story that who are doing this work, and it goes back to even like the documentaries we have just watched the last couple of weeks on the braceros. And these untold stories are who are doing this labor work, who's helping us in our backyard, who's doing a lot of this labor work and so forth. So this is one of the questions that I leave, as you watch the documentary. Why is it important to acknowledge the African diaspora in Latin America? How has it shaped religion, culture, and identity? In what ways are Afro-Latinos embracing, celebrating their African heritage in today's society? And how are younger generation Afro-Latinos engaging with distancing themselves from African diaspora and cultural resistance? So again, I'll go a little bit more of on the documentary. But one of the key takes is here when they are talking about the untold story of Latinos and often erased and left out, the origins of the African taken and stripped out of their history, misrepresentation. When we talk about bloodlines and so forth, they forget that in Africa there was kings and queens. That gets untold as well. The slave and labor, negligence of people to understand that young as 15-year-olds were being sent to these places and so forth, and not just within Central America but also South America as well. And against culture survival, what does that mean? What does that mean now as we still unacknowledge this, but also what are we don't understand of these people? And the documentary talks about they're embracing their heritage, through dances, religion, traditions, speaking about their own history, but also saving those little spots as they talk about like in Honduras and Costa Rica, how they're saving their history, how they're saving their dances, how they're saving their language and so forth, and then the practice of it as well. And I think that is important as we go forward. Think about the unknown people again, right? The sense of belonging, the untold stories. And this week we hear a lot about that from different places, right? Within the U.S., but also the people in Latin America.